Excellent. So here's our last video for Unit 4. This is Chapter 15. I called it 15.1, although it is the only video from Chapter 15 going over interest groups. So getting into the context of these linkage institutions that we've been talking about, political parties, mass media, and elections. And then this is our fourth linkage institution, which are interest groups. And so the idea of connecting the people to the government themselves, more specifically with particular issues. And we'll get into how interest groups are different than political parties as well. But more specifically, how they actually connect people to the government. So here's some examples. You have the NRA, one of the more larger budgets, bigger influence. NAACP historically and still today, even with things like endorsing candidates, is something that an interest group can do. NAACP also historically using litigation as a way of influencing policy, so using the court systems. And so basically, all of these different groups stand for different things. Oftentimes, they stand for like one issue or a specific issue to a particular demographic, but that's what we're going to get into. So just defining this, right? What is an interest group? So it's this organization of people shared by policy goals, and they're trying to basically influence the government to get these policy goals accomplished. Now, it's usually very specific policy. Parties usually have a platform, an opinion on different policies, but usually it's very general, whereas an interest group is something very specific. So like the two major differences for interest groups compared to political parties is you would really look at interest groups do not run for office. Okay, so they're not running campaigns. Interest groups will contribute to PACs. Interest groups will give different soft money donations and things like that, but they're not running a candidate. They're not running the campaign. And then the other major difference is that interest groups are the policy specialists. Political parties are more of the policy generalists. And it's very common that even, for example, a Democratic or Republican senator to have the bill written for them by an interest group because the interest groups are more the specialists on the different policies. So take education, for example. The Democrat and Republican parties have specific ideas about education, I suppose. But when you talk about like the nitty gritty ideas, say like charter schools or school choice or things like that, if you really want to have that policy written, oftentimes politicians will reach out to interest groups for help and things like that. But these are the two key differences. Political parties will run campaigns, they'll run people for office. Interest groups do not, although interest groups will contribute to campaigns. And then interest groups usually are specialists, whereas the political parties are more general. Going back to August here, when you look at interest groups, this is another definition of factions from Fed 10 from Madison. And so when we talk about the different groups interacting, it's important to also understand how this could implicate interest groups. So when you talk about the participatory government, who is participating within the government? And so which individuals participating in the government, oftentimes by voting, would utilize interest groups or would want to become a part of an interest group? And so the different interests themselves, it could depend on what voting coalition is involved. And then when you talk about pluralism, hyperpluralism, could the goals of these interest groups improve democracy? Meaning, could they bring more voices to the forefront? Absolutely. Could interest groups and their influence of government, could it lead to gridlock? Absolutely. So think of something like gun control. So we have school shootings that happen. People push Congress to make action, and oftentimes they won't pass policy. And part of that is because groups like the NRA are so influential in contributing to campaigns that many senators will not even bring a gun control bill at the federal level to the floor. And so interest groups can lead to policy being made. We looked at Mothers Against Drunk Driving influencing the drinking level at the federal level, or drinking age, I should say, at the federal level, but it could also lead to gridlock as well. And then the last theory here really is the elite class theory, is that, certain groups, have a better like financial base. You talk about the wealthy and the elite have more of an opportunity to influence policy, to influence campaigns, and so the size of an interest group or the veracity of an interest group can really come down to the funding, and even like who should be controlling that policy could influence how interest groups function as well. But the main idea about this is really just that groups interact in the government differently, regardless of the theoretical kind of discussion of politics and how these groups influence the politics. But the most important thing is that these groups themselves, the interest groups, are trying to influence policy for the sake of the people. And that's the most important thing, is it is interest groups are very democratic in the sense that they offer a platform for people that may not have the ability to bring that forward into a cohesive policy, right? So as an elderly individual, you may not be able to go out there and influence the policy, but you can join the AARP, and the AARP will lobby on your behalf for things that will benefit the elderly. So different types: economic interests, labor, agriculture, business, environment, equality, consumer, and all of these different things. So like economic interests, we're talking about, fighting for things like Social Security for the elderly. You can get into labor. So labor could be more into moving like unions and things like that. And meaning to say, all of the businesses, corporations in the United States, people may not necessarily be treated equally under the law. So it's kind of looking at that. And the other way you could look at interest groups as advocating. They are advocating for different interests. They are pushing to make sure that the people have their voices heard and the people can be connected to the actual decisions being made in the government itself. So what makes an interest group successful? So these are the top kind of 25, and there really isn't much difference today, maybe a little bit, but even just having the NRA at the top and then the AARP right under it, and you can see even the differences in the types of interest groups. Like AFL-CIO is more like labor, Chamber of Commerce, and then even going down into specific, almost like a guild almost, right? So you have like realtors, manufacturers, home builders. All of these Americans are going to have different interests, and different than a party, these are very specific interests. The Democrat or the Republican Party are so overarching that they may leave the realtors behind or the manufacturers behind. And so interest groups kind of give another kind of safety valve, I guess you could say, to get involved. So the group size plays a role. Now there is at a certain point diminishing returns, but the group size here is usually the larger the group, the more effective they can be. Also the intensity, then it's not necessarily just the funding, but the different channels in which the interest group can influence policy, which we'll get into in just a moment. And then also the funding. And most of the funding does come from dues that people pay to be a part of the interest group, like kind of like a club fee, I guess you could say. And so when you talk about being effective, large groups, they can be effective. I suppose you could say they're more likely to be effective, but it doesn't mean that it's a guarantee. So sometimes what happens with groups is that you have what's called a potential group versus the actual group. So these are people that would be interested, that have similar viewpoints. So I put like the AARP. So for the elderly, okay, so the potential group really is anyone over 55. But will they actually pay to be a part of the AARP? I don't know, maybe not. And so when you study in political science interest groups, you look at the general demographic of people who would join, and then you have to compare that with the number of people who actually join. Because what happens is you get this issue of the free rider problem. And this is the elderly that do not join the AARP, the gun owners who do not join the NRA. These are individuals that you're a free rider, you're a freeloader. You get the benefits of what the interest group is fighting for, that people are paying to be a part of so they can fight for, but you don't actually join. And so a free rider is someone who is 65 and benefits from increased funding to Medicare, but doesn't actually join the AARP. Right? Or someone who is, a pretty staunch Second Amendment supporter. They enjoy owning firearms and the freedom that provides, or the freedom, I should say, to own those firearms without the government interference. And they will pay to groups like the NRA. That'd be the actual group. But oftentimes, gun owners do not join the NRA, but benefit from the different Second Amendment freedoms that the NRA fights for. And so what comes down to it is with interest groups is oftentimes it's not just enough that they can charge like a club membership fee. Oftentimes they have to provide like selective benefits. So these are things like t-shirts and pens and coffee mugs and bags and all this kind of stuff. So the swag, right? The stuff you get for being a member, like that can entice people to join. And so, oftentimes that can benefit, but the selective benefits usually aren't enough. It's not enough that you get an AARP coffee mug. So maybe people will say, well, I will still benefit from the AARP and they don't really need me to join. And so summarize this slide is larger groups tend to have more influence, although they aren't necessarily effective, and free rider problem could be a potential issue here, and selective benefits may not be enough to entice someone to join. So this idea of like this diminished returns to get to the point where you're trying so hard to offer something, but the size of your organization you fall short of offering this. So this, to say this a different way, is this Olson's theory of large groups. So specifically with collective goods, so things like clean air, clean water, education, roads. And so if the group is too large, or they're trying to, I guess in this case, take on too much, they're trying to accomplish too much, the more they try to accomplish, the less they will get in actually accomplishing that. And so this, I guess, could be an example of hyperpluralism if it's groups interacting with each other, but just really the size of the group, it can be very difficult to provide something like clean air, clean water, education. These are such big ideas and such a tough task to really accomplish. Sometimes interest groups themselves cannot accomplish that, and it'll take much more for something to get accomplished. So in the case of like clean air and clean water, it's not enough for interest groups to lobby for this. You really need the creation of government policy like the EPA to help regulate something like this. And so, sometimes interest groups aren't enough. So getting into like the intensity, right? Because I talked a little bit about the size, but the intensity of this, the veracity, is usually when interest groups have a single issue that they focus on, they tend to be more successful. And so when you talk about something like PETA, using the psychological advantage, you take like cute animals and then it gets, well, you guys know PETA, gets pretty ugly. And so using the emotional, the pathos component of this can be very beneficial for, for different interest groups. And then the other thing with the intensity is that, oftentimes interest groups will protest, but it's different than lobbying. So for example, if you take protests, like Black Lives Matter, lots of First Amendment assembly being done, and more often now than, I would say in the founding of Black Lives Matter, there's much more lobbying occurring, but understand that advocacy in like a protest is different than paying individuals to specifically go to the different state legislatures, Congress, different local like municipalities, and trying to actually influence the policy is different than raising awareness to it. And so oftentimes interest groups that protest and lobby are much more effective, but just because there are like protests and awareness to it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being followed up as far as influencing the policy. And so oftentimes groups that are intense with the protest and follow it up with the lobbying, like the NAACP has been very effective in trying to use both of these to their advantage. But, the more lobbying just meaning trying to influence policy can make an interest group very successful. And then the last thing is the finances, right? It comes down to the money, and especially when we've talked about campaign finance reform, especially now because corporations are people. People have free speech, and giving money is considered an expression of free speech. And so, the financial resources are going to make or break different policy changes, and even like getting access to the politicians. So understand, interest groups and the people that work for interest groups, we call them lobbyists, right? They will lobby, they will advocate for a certain cause, right? And so when you talk about monetary donations, usually interest groups will get the lobbyists to go out and they'll talk to the politicians and say, hey, we would love to donate to your campaign, but understand that this is not bribery. Bribery is a felony. It is an illegal crime. What lobbyists do is they will offer to donate to campaigns for politicians in return for a meeting or a phone call. They're not actually lobbying for the congressman to vote. You can't do that. That is illegal. But if you decide to donate to a campaign and you actually get a sit-down meeting, that may be possible to influence the politician, but it is not a bribe. That's very important. Okay, so let's see. Sorry. So when you talk about access, okay, you may get that access. So for example, the NRA may get a sit-down meeting with Marco Rubio, whom they donate a lot of money to his campaign, but it doesn't mean that they're actually going to get something that they want passed in Congress. Lots of things influence what passes in Congress, and so lobbyists will usually try and influence many politicians, not just Congress, many state legislatures, local, elections, gubernatorial elections. And so the idea of what the interest groups try to do, especially the ones with funding, they will donate to campaigns. They will also write legislation for different politicians, but this is not bribing the politician. This is giving to a campaign in the hopes that they will get a sit-down meeting or a phone call. But many things, not everything works out, the way it's supposed to. And so it's an attempt, but it's not a bribe. All right. So what I had spoken about before with the meeting and the phone call, that's usually, during a term. So like if you're in Congress, oftentimes the financial support, so like the financial resources, this kind of access, you would try and take a congressman out to lunch, right? Or you would try and have a phone call with them to discuss how they could, maybe contribute to a future campaign. But a lot of the access is happening within the term. Now, between terms, you want to help someone get elected. And so really just the word electioneering to define this is participating in campaigns. People can electioneer, people can participate in campaigns, corporations can participate in electioneering. Parties are the main ones because they run the campaign, and interest groups, while they do not run the campaign, they will contribute money. And most often, interest groups will create a PAC, or they'll donate, right? So if I'm running for president or for Congress, we'll say, I can create my own PAC, and then you can have the California Teachers Association PAC. They can donate to me. They can also have money donated to them, given to me in the form of soft money donations, because they're a corporation and that cannot be limited. And so really the idea of interest groups involved in elections, it's important that you know that they don't run them, but they will give money, and they can also create their own political action committee. And so the other thing that we see, so just as we talked about with the limits that were risen on hard money with McCain-Feingold, you can now give $2,500 in the primary and then $2,500 in the general election, and as much soft money as you got. Okay. Now, the other thing that's important is with the electioneering, specifically in Congress, because, basically every congressman in both the Senate and the House have received at least some PAC money or some money from interest groups. And with this, it's really because the cost to run, it's quite almost impossible for someone to run on their own, although there are some congressmen who could definitely afford to pay for it on their own. But the idea is that the interest groups will help with the electioneering process. They'll help by contributing to individuals, but all that money goes to an incumbent. An incumbent is someone who's running for re-election. An incumbent has a 90% chance of winning in the House. It's a little bit lower in the Senate, but it is still extremely high. So what does this mean? The odds of someone running for re-election of winning are so much greater than a challenger that the PACs, the interest groups, give all their money to the incumbents. And this is usually what happens. If you're running for a re-election, you're more likely to get PAC money than if you're a challenger, if you're running for the first time. So that's in Congress, and a lot of like the financial support. Now, the other way in which we look at the actual influencing policy, there are two ways really in which interest groups can influence policy as far as actions. Like, what do they do? How do interest groups actually do this other than donating to campaigns? There's lobbying. This is where you're influencing the legislature. And then there's also litigation, where you're trying to influence the judiciary. So lobbying, which we're going to get into, is influencing usually Congress, but also state legislatures. And then litigation is the courts. So with lobbying, okay, a lobbyist is someone who works for an interest group, and they are paid by the interest group, and they usually get paid a lot of money. And their job is to go to Washington and try and gain access to the different politicians. Hey, I would love to take you out to lunch. Hey, I would love to have a meeting and discuss this policy for environmental regulations, really they're trying to influence specifically in Congress. And oftentimes the way they'll do this too is it's not just with, the finances. That's to get the meeting. Once they get the meeting, what are they doing? They're saying, you know what? Here's some strategies that I think could work well in Congress. Or you know what? Let me actually write the bill for you. Or I have all this money that you may not have access to, government funds, but in the private sector, I really think that you should present this into Congress. And so the idea that lobbyists would co-author or essentially author an entire idea and then have a congressman kind of stand behind that as like the symbol of that idea is very common. Very, very common. And so that's why I love that political cartoon where it shows the congressman in the NASCAR jumpsuit with all the different like symbols on them of the different brand logos, because that oftentimes is what Congress can feel like, is because the congressman may not be deciding what they think is best. They may not be deciding what they think their constituents think is best. They may have ulterior motives, and regardless of those motives, those lobbyists, specific employees of the interest group will step in and try and influence the policy. Okay, excuse me. So two types of lobbyists. Okay, there's those that are like full time working for the interest group, and then there are specialists oftentimes that are hired too. Okay. And then the last way, right? So lobbying, Congress, state legislature, trying to impact the legislative branch. The other way that interest groups can try and shape the policy is with litigation. Litigation is in the courts. Litigation is the judiciary system. So oftentimes Congress doesn't really work, and you would say that the most successful interest groups use litigation and lobbying to get their policies, changed. And so when you talk about litigation, the courts themselves, one way in which an interest group could use the courts is they could create or write what's called an amicus curiae brief. Amicus curiae is Latin for friend of the court, and it's basically, the brief itself is kind of like a cheat sheet of how to win a court case, right? And so if you're a lawyer, you do tons of research to figure out the best legal strategies to win a case. So the amicus curiae brief is essentially saying, we wrote it for you. And so if you're talking about trying to bring cases to sue to the Supreme Court, state courts, things like that, the NAACP does this a lot, right? So trying to sue for sake of equality in different courts, and essentially the NAACP will write a lot of the legal case that needs to be presented, oftentimes very successful, because this is, a very influential group that has a lot of financial support as well. And then the other thing, as far as litigation goes, is interest groups can decide to file a class action lawsuit. And so a class action lawsuit, different than a regular lawsuit, is where just the litigant, the individual, is suing for something. Class action lawsuit is a team or a small group of people will sue on behalf of everyone else. And so the example I have right here is with the PSA is flight attendants in the 1950s and 60s had to weigh in, and they were not allowed to be married or become married while they were working for PSA. And so what happened women flight attendants were fired for getting married, and then a group of flight attendants sued the PSA, and they won, and successfully now no flight company, corporation in the United States can create a policy where you can fire flight attendants for getting married. Now, the idea is that there was something done to a group of individuals that was inherently, against the law, and so they sued for that and successfully shaped the policy, right? So interest groups, different than political parties. They do some of the similar things, but the major difference is parties will run the campaigns, interest groups will just contribute to the campaigns. And parties are more the generalists, and they have maybe a policy on everything, but they're not necessarily experts on all the topics. And so an interest group, usually focusing on one or a couple of specific issues, is able to influence policy perhaps more effectively because they can come in with lobbyists and influence the legislature. They can come in with litigation, and they can try and influence policy in the judiciary. And so interest groups, just understand this in our discussion of linkage institutions, and let me know if you have any questions.